We have food over here. Please take it. And you've probably seen there's signs all over, like don't bring food into the auditorium. So please don't like spill, or if you spill, like clean it up, because my name is attached to this, so I'll get in trouble. And don't tell anyone. That's it. All right. Our speaker today is Jennifer Graves. She received her MA in Sociology from UH main campus and now teaches at Houston Community College. If she looks familiar to any of you, this is because she also adjuncts here at UHD as well as at main campus. Ms. Graves' research spans a wide range of interests, including gender, body, culture, social problems, and health. She has been published in the International Journal of Drug Policy, Fat Studies, Genetics in Medicine, the Journal of Ethnicity in Substance Abuse, Studies in Symbolic Interaction, Substance Use and Misuse, Journal of Psychoactive Drugs, Symbolic Interaction, and Current Pharmacogenetics and Personalized Medicine. With Samantha Kwan, she is the co-author of the forthcoming book, Framing Fat, Competing Constructions of Contemporary Culture, which will be published this May by Rutgers University Press. Dr. Kwan is also with us today. And I will say on a personal note that it is exciting to see this project come to fruition after the many, many, many glasses of wine that we shared while discussing and developing our respective dissertations. So this is really nice. Everybody, Jennifer Graves.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Sure.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today and to share this with you. This is actually the world premiere of the book, really. We have not spoken publicly about it at all, so you are the first kind of our guinea pig audience as we go through this. And one thing that I've learned is that the academics in the room will definitely get this, it's a lot easier to compress like a 20-page article into a talk than it is to take a 200-page book and try to compress it, even into a 45-minute talk. So I'm not going to be able to speak about all the things I'd like to today. I'm particularly disappointed that I had no time at all to discuss the gender, race, and class implications of our work. But I'm going to do my best to do some justice to the overall ideas that we try to present in our work. So without further ado, in the interest of time, I'll go ahead and get us started. Also, just a minor caveat. Anyone who has my classes, which some of you do, know this is the weirdest thing for me ever. Like, I move around and I jump and I do all kinds of things. So if I look sort of like weird and stiff, it's because I want to be out there and not for here. So let's get started.
Do you want to try and not use the...
I mean, I feel like as soon as you get over here, look, I get in the way of my own slide. So I'll just stand here. We'll make it happen. So I wanted to ask you guys a question to start with. How do you think the average person might complete this sentence? Fat is, or fat people are. How might the average person complete that sentence? Fat is what? What do we know about fat?
Unhealthy.
Fat is unhealthy. Thank you very much. What else do we know about fat?
People often say lack of discipline.
Yeah, that fat is a result of lack of willpower, lack of discipline. Absolutely. What else?
Frowned upon?
Yeah, fat is frowned upon in society. Absolutely. How do we feel about how fat looks? Yeah, bleh, right? Very good. Yeah, very good. Guttural example. Yeah, but fat is ugly, right? We sort of think of it as unappealing or something that makes people less attractive. All of those are absolutely spot on. So multiple ways of thinking about fat. Fat could be considered ugly, could be considered unhealthy, could be considered a matter of personal choice, the choices that we make or don't make that control our body. And also a basis for discrimination, not one that most people sort of naturally think of, but also a potential way that we can think about fat. So in other words, there are competing claims being made about the fat body, and this is just scratching the surface of those competing claims. And this is actually true of all major social issues, not just fat or overweight and obesity, to use the medical terms. Whenever there's some sort of important social issue, claims makers will attempt to frame that issue in a certain way. And framing is really an effort to simply define what's going on here. So we can take an issue like the environment, like fat, like the rising cost of healthcare, and try to explain it in some way, try to frame it in certain language and explain what it is that's going on in the world. Different ways of framing a specific issue compete with one another to be accepted as the most authoritative version of reality, as truth with a capital T. So what we try to do in the book is explore several competing claims that are made about the fat body. So we ask questions like, what is being said? How is it being said? Who is saying it? And what's their motivation for putting that message forth? So we have some specific research questions. The first and sort of most obvious is, what are claims makers saying about fat and the fat body? The second, sort of more interesting question asks, how do they approach weight-related issues? Issues like aesthetics or beauty and appearance, health, individual choice, personal responsibility, and social justice. And then the most important question asks, what are the implications of these various frames' construction for understanding equality? This is the most important question, simply because we hope that our work is going to draw attention to the stigma and discrimination that fat people face in modern society, and help to explain why the mistreatment of fat people is so prevalent. So we answer our research questions using frame analysis, which is a specific form of content analysis that simply takes frames and breaks them down into their component parts. So frame analysis talks about two different aspects of frames. The first one are reasoning devices. These, I think, are sort of the tenets of the argument. What is being said about the social issue? So in our case, what's being said about fat people and fat bodies? Then there's also framing devices. This is, how is it being said? How am I going to get across my message to you? What tools am I going to utilize? I don't want to spend a ton of time on what these are, because you're going to see them when we talk about actual frames here in just a minute. So moving into our findings, I want to start talking about the specific frames that we use, or that we talk about. The first one we label the aesthetic frame. The aesthetic frame is produced by the fashion beauty complex. Fashion beauty complex is a term that we borrowed from another scholar, Sandra Barkey, that talks about a conglomeration of industries within the fashion and beauty sort of range. So this would be cosmetics, clothing, weight loss, plastic surgery, these types of industries. So the aesthetic frame is produced by the fashion beauty complex, and the central claim, what it's trying to say, is to get across the message that fat is ugly. We cleverly call it in the book, fat is frightful, so that's how I'll be referring to it throughout the rest of the presentation. But essentially the assertion is that fat is ugly. When claimers make a claim, typically a social problem gets created when they assert that claim. So in this case, the social problem is clearly fat or the fat body. Why is it problematic? Because it's ugly. And framers are also going to talk about other things, and these are the reasoning devices that I showed a moment ago. So let's talk about the specifics of the aesthetic frame. So they're going to talk about the consequences of whatever problem is being created by the claim. They're going to talk about the cause of the problem. They'll talk about potential solutions to that problem. Then they'll try to explain why you should care about the problem. They appeal to certain principles or values that we have in an effort to convince you why it's important that you care and that you see things their way. And then we also added this sort of information about motivation. And then the framing devices are basically tactics. How do I convince you that my message is correct? So within the aesthetic frame, the consequences of fat, according to the aesthetic frame, are diminished quality of life. And specifically, they're focusing on things like how being fat is going to impede your ability to be happy. It's going to impede your ability to be as active as you might want to be. It may impede your ability to find a romantic partner. All of things that we sort of think of as goals that we would all like to accomplish. And the fat body might potentially impede those things that would improve our quality of life. When they talk about the etiology, or what causes fat, why are people fat, they focus mostly, actually almost exclusively, on personal failure, but a very specific form of personal failure. They say the reason that people are fat is because they're not using the proper products. If they would simply eat the right foods, buy the right gym memberships, have the right surgeries, wear the right clothes, buy the right cosmetics, then they wouldn't have to suffer the diminished quality of life that comes along with being fat. So, of course, what do? This is an industry-driven frame. They come along and say, but we'll sell you those products so you can use them and control your body in whatever way you see fit. So in our case, we would sell products that either make us thin or at least make us appear to be thin in an effort to conform to cultural beauty ideals. And the principle kind of goes along with consequences. You'll see that a lot of times these breakdowns, we make them seem really concrete in an effort to make our analysis replicable, but there's a lot of overlap and sort of give and take and push and pull. So the principles that they're appealing to are simply the notion that of course everybody wants to live their best life, as Oprah would say, right? And so why should we care about this issue? Because everybody should be able to be happy and have the highest quality of life possible, and fat is going to impede that ability. Since they are an industry-driven frame, their motivation is primarily profit. They want to convince you that your body is not okay in the state that it's currently in, so that you will then go out and buy the products that will make your body acceptable. The primary tactics used by the fashion beauty complex are going to be visuals and catchphrases. Catchphrases are simply slogans, short, succinct statements that kind of capture what a frame is trying to say, and visuals are obviously just images. The reason these are the most common is because the cultural artifacts that make up the aesthetic frame are in fact advertisements, which are dominated by large visual images accompanied by copy. So let me show you an example. So this is an advertisement for an anti-aging moisturizer produced by Elizabeth Arden. And first of all, we definitely see the tactics here, right? A very stunning, striking, draws your eye to it visual image, alongside several catchphrases that are all over the ad. And so we see an example of the types of tactics that this ad frame uses. But we also see some of the key points of the aesthetic frame illustrated here. So first of all, we do see that fat is considered frightful. And we see this in a couple of ways. The most obvious is, can you all read that text in the upper right corner at least? Kind of sort of, okay, I'll read it to you. It says, I want firmer, smoother looking skin with no sign of stretch marks or age spots. So we're clearly vilifying loose skin and stretch marks here, which are both associated with a fat body. So clearly an implication that fat is frightful. Also, throughout most of the advertisements of the fashion beauty complex, we see the complete symbolic annihilation of fat bodies. Ads portray slender, taut bodies, the culturally expected ideals, and we certainly see that in this ad. We also see the assertion that that fat is fixable. In other words, that you have control over your body. If you just use the right products, you will be able to have the body that you'd like to have. And we see that simply by the existence of the product. If the product didn't purport to help you with this issue, then it wouldn't exist, right? That's the whole reason that it's here. And then there are some specifics here in the ad. It says that it's going to transform you, that it will get rid of things like loss of firmness and elasticity, sagging, and any evidence of weight gain, even vilifying weight gain that comes alongside pregnancy and childbearing. So clearly here, fat is frightful, fat is fixable through the proper product usage. Let me give you another exemplar. Exemplars are also part of the framing devices. They're examples that really illustrate key points about a frame. So Anti-Gym is a now out of business fitness club that was in the Western United States, but they had a fairly decent run and a fairly controversial run while they were in business, and they really do a great job exemplifying the central messages of the aesthetic frame. So first of all, the notion that fat is frightful and slender is therefore sexy. We see this most prominently in one of their TV commercials. I wish I could show them to you, by the way, but the website is down now that they're out of business and they're no longer available. But it ends with, you are never going to have a hubby if you're chubby. Making it clear, right? No one's going to love you, no one's going to like you, you're disgusting if you're fat, right? We also see the idea that fat is caused by personal failure to use the correct products. Most exemplified in this idea, no chubbies allowed. This is the main slogan that they use in all their advertising. And they go on so further to define specifically what a chubby is to the Anti-Gym. An unmotivated, lazy slob who wants to blame everybody but themselves for their shortcomings. Whatever it is that they're not doing, their individual failings. So clearly, why are they fat? Because of their shortcomings. We also see an allusion to the idea that fat diminishes quality of life in the Anti-Gym's website and advertisements. So specifically, they promise fast and lasting results, a trim tummy, all-night stamina, a look that turns heads, and a great lifestyle. They don't even have to go into details. That's such a broadly accepted value or principle that they don't even need to tell you what that means. They just need to tell you that their product will deliver it. And then the notion that fat is fixable. Obviously, the very existence of the Anti-Gym, just like the existence of the moisturizer, tells us that they're offering some sort of solution to the fat body, but we can see it even more clearly. One of the other catchphrases that they use says, people cease to be chubbies the moment they decide to do something about it. So all you have to do is make that choice and bam, you can have whatever body you would like to from the perspective of the aesthetic frame. I have a couple of screenshots from their website, just because I think it's fascinating. If you looked at this website, would you think that this was a gym? Right? It looks like softcore porn, basically, right? And they're definitely sort of promising this notion you are going to be aesthetically appealing. So aesthetically appealing that you no longer have to hide your body in the dark. You can have sex with the lights on if you would use Anti-Gym's product and control your unruly body. So very interesting. And by the way, that's the founder. The guy at the top, Michael Kościak, or I don't know how to pronounce it, but the guy that invented this whole idea of the Anti-Gym. Okay, let's move on to the health frame. So the next frame that we explore in the book, we label the health frame. The health frame is produced primarily by the Centers for Disease Control. I think most people are probably aware of what that is. They're sort of the major public health organization in the US, charged with sort of keeping track of public health issues and doing research on public health. So their central claim is that fat is unhealthy, or again, as we cleverly say in the book, fat is fatal, right? So setting up the same social problem here, still fat bodies are the issue, but we're no longer concerned about how they look, we're concerned about how they perform and how healthy they are. So when they talk about the consequences, they're not going to focus on how being ugly diminishes your quality of life. They're going to focus on how there are health risks associated with what they call overweight and obesity. So they focus specifically on morbidity, which means all the illnesses and sicknesses that go along allegedly with being overweight or obese. And then mortality, the fact that death can come premature as a result of overweight or obesity. They also spend a relatively substantial portion of time talking about the economic costs of obesity, talking about how, for instance, obese employees, research has shown, have higher absenteeism rates, and that costs employers money. Or they use more claims on health insurance, and that costs people that share that risk through the insurance program more money. So they're very concerned about what it actually costs dollars-wise for people to be overweight or obese in society. They also focus on the cause of fat as being personal failure, but since they're not selling a product, they're not an industry, they focus more on lifestyle issues. They say that the failure is not to use the right products, it's when you don't eat right and you don't exercise. That's what's going to cause you to get fat. So what's the solution then? Obviously implied here is start eating right and start exercising. Change your lifestyle so that you can change your body. The principles that they are appealing to, first and foremost, is simply this notion that all of us want to be healthy and should in fact strive to be healthy, because that's part of our job as sort of members, contributing members of society. And then also, since they do focus on economic costs, there's also an allusion to this idea that we all are responsible for being, for each other in terms of economic issues. So we all need to be as fiscally responsible as possible so we're not putting strain on other people because of our unruly bodies. They rely on slightly different tactics. They rely both on data, so this is going to be evidence and research, along with visuals that typically portray that data in an easy to digest form. They use data from outside researchers as well as data that they produce themselves, because the CDC does gather quite a bit of data and analyze it and present those results to the public. So I'll show you a couple of images here. The one that dominates the screen there on the left is obviously sort of a panic-inducing visual, a little bit, right? We've got this body, and on it are diagrammed all the potential morbidities that research has allegedly shown are linked to overweight and obesity. So anyone who does have concerns about their body weight is going to look at that and go, oh my gosh, look at the risk that I'm at as a result of my body size. We also see an allusion to the economic consequences. That picture in the bottom right is actually a scale that they've edited. They've put a dollar sign where the weight should be, and they've put calculator buttons on the foot pads to clearly indicate when you step on there, not only is your weight potentially rising, but so are the costs to society. And then last but not least, this notion of fat being fixable through lifestyle change. We have this woman in the upper right, very victorious pose. She's standing on her scale. She's obviously just reached some major weight goal for herself. And she says, I did it, and so can you. You have the power to change. You have the power to control your weight. An exemplar that is especially sort of poignant when we talk about the health frame is the Let's Move campaign. Let's Move, for those of you who don't know, is the current First Lady's anti-obesity campaign focusing largely on children and adolescents. And it really exemplifies the central messages of the health frame, even though it's not directly affiliated with the CDC. One thing that's important to know about frames is although we focus on one producer, they're actually produced and supported by a variety of different agents throughout society. So the Let's Move contributes to the health frame. So first of all, the notion that fat is fatal. Right on the front page of the website, you see this assertion that doctors and scientists are concerned about the rise of obesity in children and teens because it can lead to all these morbidities: heart disease, type 2 diabetes, asthma, sleep apnea. The Let's Move campaign also targets on the notion of economic costs. They say the physical and emotional health, so now we're back to fat is fatal, of an entire generation, and the economic health and security of our nation are at stake if we don't address this issue of childhood overweight and obesity. Also, the assertion that fat is fixable. First of all, the stated goal of the Let's Move campaign is to solve the problem of obesity within a generation. Obviously, it's fixable if we can solve the problem, especially in such a relatively short time frame. Also, we see this in the strategies that they recommend. Let's Move is all about lifestyle change, making sure that kids are able to make good choices, to eat right, and to be physically active so that they can avoid having an overweight or obese body. And this is just a snapshot of what the website looks like, very appealing to children, and intentionally so, because that's the target. Then we have third, the choice and responsibility frame. This was produced by the Centers for Consumer Freedom, one that we're probably not aware of. The Centers for Consumer Freedom is they don't like to be referred to as a lobby group. They're a nonprofit organization that is supported by a lot of industries in the food and beverage industry. So that includes things like Tyson Foods, Monsanto, Coca-Cola, but essentially they serve as sort of a lobbying organization for the food and beverage industry. So their claim, we're kind of moving in a little bit different direction here. Rather than simply, how would we describe fat or what does it do? They say fat is a matter of personal choice. That essentially all of us should be in control of the choices that we make, and what those do to our body, we have to deal with those consequences and take responsibility for them, whatever they are. So the concern, the focus here is that fat is a matter of personal choice. So fat itself is not a problem from the CCF standpoint. The problem is when the government tries to interfere with our choices. So that's the social problem that they're constructing or creating here. And obviously the consequences of that are that if the government starts interfering, maybe they're going to regulate advertising, maybe they're going to put taxes on foods or drinks that I like, but that's going to limit my choices. Maybe I won't be able to afford those things, or I won't even learn about those products if the advertising is limited. So limitations on freedom and choice tend to be the consequences of the problem of government interference. And they also, you're going to see a theme here, right, across cause, they also indict individuals. They say it's personal failure that leads people to be overweight or obese in our society. But interestingly, since they are a food and beverage driven frame, rather than focusing on what foods we're eating as being part of the equation, they focus almost entirely on how sedentary we are in contemporary culture. That we're not going out and our kids aren't going out in the streets and playing, they're playing video games instead. That we're not engaging in physical labor that would burn a lot of calories, that we all sit at desks. But there's been technological improvements that have allowed us to, for instance, improve transportation and not have as much physical activity. So they focus on only one side of that lifestyle equation, specifically get out there and get active. If you do that, that will help control body weight. Their solution is actually no solution at all. What they say is that we're concerned about government interference. That's what we're worried about as a problem. So what we want to do, get the government to leave the food and beverage industry alone. Stay out of our choices and stay out of our lives. So they really advocate a laissez-faire, do-nothing policy. Let the market dictate. So the essential argument here would be, if people were really concerned about what sugary drinks were doing to their health or their weight or their children, then they would stop buying those drinks and the market would take care of the problem. So let the market do the work. Don't allow government to come in and dictate our choices for us. So the obvious principles here are simply freedom of choice, personal responsibility as central to the frame. Their motivation, like the aesthetic frame, though, is also profit. Since they're representing large industries, and industry's goal is to improve their bottom line through the sales of products and services, that's their primary driving motivation. It makes sense. If governments come in and they do put taxes on sugary soft drinks, it is certainly foreseeable that we might purchase less of those, which would then decrease the profit margin of that industry. They also rely, like the CDC, on both data and visuals, but the CCF does not produce its own data. They rely on outside experts. And their visuals are really compelling. They use a lot of cartoons, but they also use a lot of producing of ads that they put in relatively major publications at great expense to get across their message. So I'll show you a couple of them. If we look at this one on the left, what you're going to see here is that this is a direct response to what the CDC says about obesity. The CDC consistently talks about how fat is killing us, fat is making us sick, and so they will refer to fat as an epidemic that's sweeping across the nation. The CCF has said, in contrast, it's not an epidemic, it's not a plague, it's not a terror, and they say maybe it's all hype. And that's one of the things that the CCF frequently says, that these are health myths, that this is obesity hype, and they say the truth is out there. Don't listen to what the CDC is telling you about fat and fat bodies. And the other one is really exemplary of that message of it's our freedom that's at stake here when the government interferes with our food choices. And it says you are too stupid to make good personal decisions about foods and beverages. The New York Department of Health/Hype has used your tax dollars to launch an advertising campaign demonizing soda. Food cops and politicians are attacking food and soda choices that they don't like. Have they gone too far? So clearly trying to get you to question, is it okay for the government to put policies in place that may make it difficult for me to make the choices that I want to make. And then at the bottom, we see a catchphrase. It's your food, it's your drink. Two pretty inane things in the grand scheme of things, but the puncher, it's your freedom. It's not just your food and your drink, it's your freedom at stake if you start allowing the government to control the choices that you make about something this simple, soon they'll move on to other things. And the example I want to show you here, an exemplar, this is actually a commercial. It aired not during the Super Bowl, but during the Super Bowl last year, so it's a little over a year old now. And it wasn't produced by the Centers for Consumer Freedom, but by one of their allies, the Americans Against Food Taxes, which is in fact a lobbying group. So let's see if we can get it to load. Hopefully there's internet on this computer. Everyone cross your fingers. Claude, do you know it should be internet equipped or no? No, okay. Here's this. Not connected.
Okay, you need to log.
Yeah, we'll log in.
Yeah.
Okay, it's not that important. Okay.
Log in.
Okay. How do I do that? Do I just go into here?
It should load.
Oh, it's working. Let's try it. Okay. Sorry guys, technical difficulties. Should go on my computer. Okay, it's trying to get me logged in now, you're right. I have logged in. Oh, it's not that important. I don't want to keep all your all day. Okay. I'll tell you what it says. Okay. So basically she's walking through the aisles and she's putting all kinds of things, notably soda, right, into her cart. And she's walking around going, I can't believe the government wants to tell me what to do. You know, as soon as they start telling me what to do, they put taxes on my stuff. I'm not going to be able to take care of my family. This is a big deal. This is really problematic. Okay, all right. So we see some central messages of the choice and responsibility frame here, particularly in the very end of the commercial, which I have the quote here for. So first of all, we see the fact that she's shopping and she's, with reckless abandon, just whatever she wants, she's putting into her cart, clearly implies at least that it's not food and beverage that we need to be concerned about when we talk about fat bodies. She also alludes to the consequences of regulation. She says very specifically, it's going to drive up the prices, which is going to make it harder for me to take care of my family, and that's a problem. And the principle they're appealing to is very clearly this idea of making our own choices for ourselves and our families. And then the solution is alluded to at the very end, that the laissez-faire, get the government out of my family, get the government out of my choices, because there's a voiceover at the very end, the only voice besides the woman that's portrayed in the commercial. And he says, government needs to trim its budget fat and leave our grocery budgets alone. So stay out, stay away, let me do and make my own choices. And last but not least, we have the social justice frame. The social justice frame is constructed by the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. This is an organization that they call themselves a civil rights organization, and they're dedicated to fighting for equality for people of size. So just like the NAACP fights for equality for people of color, NAFTA is doing the same work for people of size. So the central claim of the social justice frame is that fat bias is prevalent and problematic. So here again, we're not vilifying fat. Fat is not the social problem. The social problem that's being constructed is this notion of size discrimination, that there is differential treatment based on what your body looks like or what size your body is. They focus a lot on presenting data about the prevalence of size discrimination, and they focus on 3 key settings. So they talk about discrimination in education, discrimination in employment, and discrimination in healthcare. And I'll tell you a little bit just to give you a flavor of what they talk about. They cite studies that show teachers hold negative stereotypes of overweight students, perceiving them as untidy, emotional, and less likely to succeed. They say that fat workers are frequently stereotyped as undisciplined, slovenly, and unambitious, and as a result are denied advancement and promotion, sometimes aren't hired, they suffer consequences in the employment realm. And they also point out that healthcare providers frequently have negative perceptions of fat individuals as well. For instance, 31%, so a full 1 in 3 nurses, said they would prefer not to care for obese patients. And nearly 25%, so 1 in 4 now, admitted that obese patients repulse them. So clear focus on this idea that fat people are treated differently, they are perceived differently in society. And so the consequences of that of size discrimination are, of course, the consequences of any other type of discrimination, that it diminishes the well-being of those who are discriminated against. They're limiting their opportunities by affecting their mental health, whatever it may be, it diminishes their well-being. This is where we break from the theme of personal failure. The social justice frame is the only frame that does not specifically indict individuals as failing to meet the culturally accepted standards for body size. So they say that actually the cause of fat is really multifaceted, and that it's too simplistic to say it's just about products, or it's just about exercise, or it's just about eating right. They say really it's a multifaceted conglomeration of things that come together. So these do include our behaviors, such as what we eat and how much exercise we get, but it also includes things like genetics and metabolism, which we have no control over, and includes things like social structure. The notion that, for instance, healthy foods tend to be far less affordable than unhealthy foods. So there are other issues at play here, rather than simply whether we choose to use products or choose to eat right and exercise. So their solution to this issue of size discrimination is obviously to fight that size discrimination in multiple ways. They do this largely through education, simply getting the word out about what's going on, through activism like letter writing campaigns, public protests, but also through sort of lobbying to get weight and height included as protected classes in various legal policies across the nation. And so that's their goal, is to sort of fight or end size discrimination. They also speak in some contexts about regulating industry and how that might potentially improve the bias and stigma and discrimination that fat people face, because specifically the weight loss industry in particular, which is part of that fashion beauty complex, right, indicts fat individuals, making it seem acceptable to then mistreat them because they just didn't make the right choices for themselves. And so they want to regulate diet industry. They also focus a lot on how diets don't work, that this is one of the few products where you can go out and make claims that you don't have to back up with results, and that we should have tighter regulations on what those ads can say and what those programs can promise. The principle that they're really working with here, that it's a basic notion that we want to protect human rights, that everyone deserves to be treated with equality and respect and have equal opportunities in our society, and that size discrimination is getting in the way of that. And their motivations, as we've labeled them, the social justice frame, is obviously to improve that equality, to fight for social justice for people of all shapes and sizes. NAFA relies almost exclusively on data as a way to convince people of their version of reality. They also don't produce their own data. They go to outside sources, academics, researchers, various agencies that produce data on these types of issues. They use a lot of data from the Red Center for Food Policy at Yale, which is an organization, one of the few places actually, that's doing really rigorous academic research on fat bias and stigma and policies. So an exemplar of NAFA's social justice frame is a letter that they actually wrote to Mrs. Obama when she launched the Let's Move campaign that we spoke about a few minutes ago. And it really does highlight the central messages of the social justice frame. So first of all, the notion that fat people face discrimination and that compromises their well-being or leads to negative outcomes. So we see that first in this quote from the letter. NAFA encourages the First Lady to consider all the research before supporting any program that may do more harm than good, that we're compromising the well-being of people who are affected by this program. And then they do go into some specifics. So for instance, the letter goes on to say, evidence shows that when important figures place importance on weight control rather than health, this can contribute to body dissatisfaction, low self-esteem, and weight bias among children and adolescents. So alluding to research that has shown this is the case. And certainly if, if Mrs. Obama is an important figure, so she would fall into this category. Also the assertion that fat is not within an individual's control, that it is not in fact fixable through either lifestyle change or product use, specifically focusing on the idea that diets don't work. We see this in the letter, when they write, prescribing diets is in effect prescribing weight cycling, and many people will end up fatter in the long run. So even really saying, you're actually undermining your own initiative. If your initiative is to get people to lose weight, or children and adolescents to lose weight, diets are not the solution. That's not the method that's going to get you to your goal. But they do offer another solution. It's not hopeless. They say, Mrs. Obama, what you could do is embrace a health at every size type of approach. Health at every size basically says that healthy habits are good for everybody, no matter what their size. They believe that we can be healthy independent of what size our bodies are. It doesn't matter where you start or where you end up. The idea is, are you engaging in healthy habits like joy in movement, intuitive eating, things like that. And this is a snapshot of the newsletter where they printed this, but it also went out to a number of major media outlets in an effort to actually get Mrs. Obama's attention. How am I doing on time?
It is 3:15.
Okay.
You've got as much time as you need.
Awesome. We're almost there. Okay. Notably, there are competing competing voices, though, about each of these issues. So if we're talking about aesthetics or health or social justice or choice and responsibility, there's not just one view, supported by one frame. They kind of dialogue and interact with each other about these different issues. So when we talk about beauty, for instance, we know for certain that the aesthetic frame maintains that fat is frightful. Well, what NAPA says is no, fat can actually be foxy, that it can be attractive, it can be sexy, and they really get this point across in multiple avenues. One of the things they do is they rely on fat positive imagery. I'll show you. No, there it is. Okay. I'll show you one. So this is the Venus of Willendorf. This is one of the oldest known representations of a human that we have. And obviously, she's fat, right? She's a fertility goddess, but she's got these really sort of voluptuous, beautiful curves. And so the social justice frame often will hold this up as an icon of, hey, fat is something to be revered. It's the oldest known human figurine. It's beautiful, it's acceptable, perhaps even sexy. Okay. Oh, that took us back too far. Sorry, guys. 1 second. So what happens when you reorder slides? The last minute. Okay. Come on. Okay. So fat positive images. Also, they embrace fat admiration. Fat admirers are simply people who have a preference for a larger partner. And NAPA makes a very overt statement, policy statement about this, and says fat admiration or a preference for a fat partner is as valid as any other preference based on physical characteristics. So if you can say, I like people with blue eyes, or I like men who are taller than me, then it's also okay to say, I like partners with large bodies. And that's just as acceptable. They even go on to say, I don't have the quote here, but that in a society where 65% of people are overweight or obese, that it's actually normal to be attracted to somebody that has a larger body, that it's not some sort of extreme fetish. They also support this notion that fat can be physically attractive by aligning themselves with the field known as fat studies. Claude introduced me and said I do a lot of work in this field, and this certainly qualifies as one of those pieces. But fat studies is an interdisciplinary area of research that really tries to understand, critique, and break down the negative assumptions that we have about fat people in our society. And one of the things that fat studies is very clear about is that we have to critique the aesthetic frame, that it's our responsibility to turn to it with a critical eye, simply because appearance and body norms vary widely across time and place. So when we think, oh, fat is ugly and that's what everyone has thought, if you look back historically or you look cross-culturally, you find that that's not in fact the case. When we turn our attention to the issue of health, you kind of saw this a little bit in that advertisement from the CCF, that the CCF really directly contests what the CDC says, calling it obesity hype, calling it health myths, basically saying that they're blowing smoke and that you should take it with a grain of salt. So specifically, the CCF asserts about health that obesity does not lead to higher morbidity, higher mortality, or higher costs. And one example of this is they really like to pick on the CDC because the CDC has revised the number of obesity-related deaths at least 3 times in relatively recent memory. So their initial assertion was that 400,000 people, more than who smoke, die each year as a result of overweight and obesity. Then they were like, well, actually, we think it's 365,000. And then eventually it came out, oh, it's actually only 112,000. So the CCF uses that, they capitalize on that sort of error, saying, see, they don't know what they're talking about, you shouldn't believe what they're saying. And then we have NAPA's take on health as well, which I also alluded to before, about this health at every size notion, that fat does not necessarily signify poor health, the way the CDC wants you to think that it does, and that good health can best be realized independent from considerations of size through the adoption of healthy behaviors. When it comes to choice and responsibility, we also hear some competing voices. So the CCF encourages people to make whatever choices they want. In fact, that's their primary agenda. How can I protect those choices so that you can choose whatever you would like to maintain your freedom? So the CCF really says, do whatever you'd like. It doesn't matter if it's healthy or unhealthy. We want to protect that choice. The CDC, though, actually implores us to make the right choice, specifically the healthy choice. So yes, you could go to McDonald's and eat that for every meal, but you could also eat fresh fruits and vegetables and salad. And it's a moral obligation for you, because you need to maintain your health for the good of society and for your place in it. It's a moral imperative that you go out and do the things that are going to make sure that you maintain health, that you make the correct choices about what to do. And last but not least, we can take a look at some competing voices about social justice. So the fashion beauty complex, while NAPA is saying, ooh, discrimination is wrong, this is bad, we should fight it, the fashion beauty complex really embraces it in the sense that discrimination is inherent to the aesthetic frame, because it's all about separating the beautiful from the ugly and rewarding people who meet our sort of hegemonic cultural ideals about what bodies should look like, and then punishing those who fail to conform. So discrimination is simply part of the process. Here are the beautiful, or in our case the thin, and here are the ugly, or in our case the fat. And then the CDC, they actually acknowledge that people of size do face bias, stigma, and discrimination, but it's truly an afterthought. They'll go on for pages and pages and pages about the sickness, about the dying, about the economic costs, and then they go, oh yeah, sometimes they get treated differently, and then they move on to other things. So it's really an afterthought for them. But they're not totally unconcerned with social justice. They just take a slightly different bent on it. Their concern is about the unequal prevalence rates that go along with overweight or obesity. So they're really concerned about the fact that, for instance, people in lower socioeconomic statuses are at higher risk for overweight or obesity than those in the middle or higher classes, and that people of racial and ethnic minorities are at higher risk than non-minorities. So their focus on social justice is a little different, not about size, people of size versus sort of average size people, but about among people of size, how that's unequally distributed. Which one of these views, though, do we think resonates with the public? That's an important question when you talk about frames, because just because a frame exists doesn't mean that anyone believes that it's true. So we also investigated that. Do people buy into what these frames are saying? So starting with the aesthetic frame, what do you think? Do you think people believe that fat is frightful?
Yes.
That was one of the first ones we came up with right at the beginning, absolutely. Studies show that fat people are consistently thought of as shapeless, unappealing, and unattractive. All synonyms for ugly, right? That central claim. Also, my favorite statistic in the entire book, one study found that half of the young women surveyed said they would rather be hit by a truck than be fat. That's how frightful it is in our society to be sort of construed as overweight or fat. They also buy into the notion that fat is fixable. We see this largely through investigations of industry expenditures. We spend $19 billion a year in America on gym memberships and $60 billion on weight loss products that at least NAPA would tell you don't work. Right? So obviously we're voting with our dollars here that we believe, we're buying these products because we believe we can take control over our bodies. Also, at any given time, 1 in 4 Americans is on a specific diet, and as much as 43% of Americans claim that they're trying to lose weight. So there's this overwhelming prevalence of weight loss behaviors in our society. And you could make the argument, well, people try to lose weight for lots of reasons. For instance, maybe it's in the name of health. Or researchers have addressed that as well. When we ask people what the motivations are for weight loss, they do in fact cite beauty very frequently as one of the reasons why they would like to lose weight. And when we come to the health frame, their central claim that fat is fatal. Do you think people buy into that fat's bad for your health? I think most people do. I'm saying a few nods out of quiet. Okay. I guess it's better when I have students because they feel like obligated to respond, right? They have to. But yeah, absolutely. People do buy into this notion as well. So one national survey found that Americans think obesity is a serious health concern, and they believe it increases their risk for very specific comorbidities like high blood pressure, heart disease, and diabetes. They also, the health frame is also sort of asserting that fat is fixable but through lifestyle change. So we see that same evidence about the prevalence of weight loss behavior is coming up as an issue. But then multiple studies also show that the most often cited motivation for weight loss is in fact health. So while beauty does come up, and it comes up frequently, health is the #1 reason people say that they're attempting to control their weight. Choice and responsibility. This is where it gets a little hairier, right? What do you think? Do you think people believe that fat is a personal responsibility, that we are personally responsible for our bodies?
Sure.
Absolutely, yeah. This actually gains quite a bit of resonance as well. One study found, this is a huge number, 93.3% of people surveyed agreed with the statement that overweight individuals are responsible for their own bodies, which is exactly what the CCF says. Not just about our bodies, but we're responsible for everything, including our bodies. So that element certainly resonates. And then support for sort of letting the market be also tends to come up when we do look at what the public sentiments are about regulation of the food and beverage industry. So for instance, a 2010 survey reported that 66% of people surveyed either opposed or had no opinion about taxing carbonated sugary soft drinks. So there's relatively limited support for the government getting more involved in regulation of food and beverage industries. The social justice frame. What do you think about this one? Do you think this one resonates with people? Do people think that fat people are mistreated and that that's a bad thing? Not necessarily, right? There's sort of a little bit of a mixed kind of response to this going on. So the social justice frame does assert that being fat leads to being stigmatized, discriminated against, and having limited opportunities. And we certainly see that that is the case. simply in the abundance of research that shows that fat people do experience various forms of stigma and discrimination across multiple settings. The widespread nature of this stigma and discrimination suggests that Americans condone the negative treatment of fat individuals. So the central claim of the social justice frame, that fat bias is a problem, does not resonate. That's clear simply in the amount of fat bias that's prevalent in society. We can also see evidence of that in the amount of people who will admit to their own explicit fat biases. So 16% of Americans report they have less respect for overweight people. 29% report that they view those who are significantly overweight more negatively. And so that's sort of our perceptions of that. But this also comes through in our behaviors and actual discrimination. 1 in 5 Americans said they would be less likely to hire somebody who is overweight. So there are real consequences here, and we wouldn't see those consequences if people thought that fat bias and discrimination were problematic. When it comes to policies prohibiting weight discrimination, the public tends to have kind of mixed feelings about this. The research, which is very limited in scope, by the way, at this point, seems to suggest that it kind of depends on how you word it. In other words, how you frame the policy even will impact how people view it. So less than half of Americans, for instance, thought that fat people should be subjected to the same protections that people with disabilities get. But when you phrase it such as, should it be illegal for an employer to refuse to hire, or to fire, or to deny a promotion to someone based on their body size, a full 75% of people say, yeah, that should in fact be illegal, that that's problematic. So there's a little bit of a mixed feelings about this idea of whether height and weight should be protected. However, the way that we can sort of definitively answer the question is by looking at the existing US legal climate. When we do, what we find is that there must not be very much support for putting height and weight as protected categories, because if we really wanted that as a people, we would demand it from our government, and we haven't. Only 1 state and a handful of cities and municipalities currently protect weight in their legal statutes. And finally, I want to conclude by talking about why this matters. As you can see, it's kind of a little bit hairy, I guess, to sort of try to break down these frames and understand the way that they dialogue with each other and how they're trying to get across the messages that they're getting across. So I want to talk about why it matters and why we wanted to write this book. So first of all, you may have seen on the table that I classified the frames as either dominant or reactionary. So I'm going to talk about what that really means. Dominant frames are going to be the first 2 we discussed, the aesthetic frame and the health frame. They're labeled dominant because they are the sort of natural, taken for granted ways of understanding the fat body. They're the 2 assertions about fat that naturally come to mind for most people in contemporary Western culture. They also are labeled dominant because they tend to encourage body conformity. They're telling us what our bodies should look like and what we should do to make sure that our bodies look that way. So they're pushing us toward those cultural beauty ideals. The reactionary frames are the last 2, choice and responsibility and social justice. We first and foremost labeled them reactionary because they did arise in response to the dominant frames. As the message that fat is ugly and as the message that fat is unhealthy came to dominate public sentiments, these other frames emerged to react to or respond to those claims. So they are reactionary in that sense. They're also reactionary because they are not the natural taken for granted ways of understanding the fat body. Very few people, when you ask them, what does fat mean, would say, well, it's about my personal choices, or oh, it's about social justice. That doesn't readily come to mind the way that ugly and unhealthy do. And they also are encouraging bodily diversity. There's no sort of assertion from the CCF or NAFA about what our bodies ought to do, or what our bodies should look like. For instance, the CCF will tolerate any and all bodies as long as they're consuming food and beverages. Right? That's the primary goal, and that the people take responsibility for whatever the choices are that they make. And NAFA actually openly embraces body diversity and says, we really should accept people in all their forms, in all their shapes and sizes, that all bodies are beautiful and deserve to have equal treatment. And if we revisit the causal claims, as I mentioned, you see a theme throughout. It's personal failure, personal failure, personal failure, and then suddenly the social justice frame says, well, maybe it's not personal failure. Maybe there's something else going on here. But 3 out of the 4 frames do cite personal failure as the cause of fatness. So ultimately, they're saying the individual is to blame for their body size. If they would just use the right products, exercise, eat right, they would have a more culturally acceptable, in our case, thin body. While the social justice frame goes the opposite way and says that fat people are not blameworthy because, in fact, fat is complicated, that there are multiple causes of body size. When we ask what the public believes, though, what do you think? Are they buying into the fact that it's our fault that we're fat, or do they think that it's out of our control? Definitely our fault, right? lots of public sentiment supports that notion that individuals are to blame. So for instance, a 2004 Gallup poll found that 75% of people believe obesity is a result of bad eating and bad lifestyle habits. A full 65% in a 2005 study said that lack of willpower to diet or exercise is the cause of obesity. So it's clear here, absolutely. The idea that individuals are to blame for their body size, as the first three things assert, does absolutely resonate in the public imagination. This is important because it's this belief in the mutability of the body that justifies size-based discrimination. I'm going to go into a little detail to make that clearer. So there's a legal scholar at Stanford who wrote a book in 2010, and she talks about physical characteristics in the book. One thing she asserts is that physical characteristics actually exist along a continuum. And so at one end, you have the immutable characteristics, immutable meaning unchangeable, things you don't have control over. So things like age, sex, race. Because the public believes that those are things we cannot control, we have actually outlawed discrimination based on those things. We said it's unfair and unjust, and we need to give people legal protection. At the other end of the spectrum, we have these mutable or changeable characteristics, things like how we do our hair, what clothes we wear, if we have tattoos or piercings. Since those are perceived as being within our control, they're also seen as open to derision. If I don't like the haircut you got, it's okay for me to be like, your hair is ugly, right? If I don't like your skin color, it's not culturally acceptable for me to be like, your skin is too light, right? So we have this sort of division between what's acceptable to mistreat people based on things that are within their power, and what's not, things that are out of their control. Since it's clear from the causal resonance here that the public places body size on the on the mutable or changeable end of the spectrum, body size discrimination is deemed justifiable because we presume that fat people do have control, that they could make better choices and have a more culturally acceptable body, and that since they're choosing not to do that, it's okay for us to mistreat them or treat them differently. So, ultimately, we've now seen that the aesthetic and the health frames are homogenizing, right? They lead to body conformity. And the choice and responsibility and social justice frames promote body diversity, though it's for different reasons, in the name of profit for the CCM and in the name of social justice for NAFTA. We've also talked about how core tenets of the aesthetic, health, and choice and responsibility frames generally align with public sentiments. They resonate. People believe what these frames are telling them. And this is particularly true of the notion that individuals are in control of their body size. So, as such, Framing Fat, our book, is really about unveiling the cultural discourse that frames fat individuals for committing the crime of body nonconformity. The three most powerful frames, the aesthetic, health, and choice and responsibility frames, present incriminating evidence that portrays fat people as failures and blames them for failing to meet culturally constructed body norms. NAFTA's rebuttal attempts to exonerate fat people by awakening the public to the injustice of the other frames. Unfortunately, as we've seen, it falls on the ears of a mostly unsympathetic jury because messages condemning fat bodies resonate in the public imagination and fat bias and stigma remain prevalent. We hope that our work and our presentation today, in careful analysis of both what the frames are saying as well as how they are saying it, will shed light on the oppressive nature of modern understandings of the fat body and how they negatively impact the lived experiences of people of size in an effort to ensure that people of all shapes and sizes are in fact treated with dignity and equality.